and you strengthen us, and you fortify us for that which you've asked us to do. So bless us, we pray, in the Saviour's name. Amen. Amen. And so the Lord comes to Gideon, begins to deal with him, begins to speak to him. And in verse 13 we read, Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? Where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us, and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. In the 1700s, Charles Edward Stuart was in Glenfinnan in the Scottish Highlands. He was a leader of, you might say, a clan of the Scots people, a tall man, a young man, and an exciting prospect. He also was an heir of Scottish royalty, and he returned to Scotland to really be a representative of the Scottish people, to recapture the throne from the Brits. Of course, at this stage, George II was the British king. He was a hard man, an arrogant man, a cruel man, and he insisted on only speaking German. And so you can imagine the Scottish Highlanders, well, they certainly didn't like this. They didn't take too kindly to him and to his rulership. And they longed for the day when Charles Edward Stuart would come and regain the throne for their own, for themselves. And so events transpired at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. And it seemed that the Scots at the first had the upper hand. But there was a quick turn of events. The Scots, they were eventually crushed by the English army. And whilst Charles Edward Stuart, well, he got away, but much of the Scottish army, they sadly, they didn't make it. They died in battle. And so Charles Stuart, he escaped to France. And he planned one day, of course, of gaining strength, gaining a bit of a following, sending back to Scotland, rising up maybe another army, another Scottish army. That was his plan as he sort of was in hiding in France for a little while. But that's not how life panned out for Charles Edward Stuart. Because if you were to meet him 20 years later, you would find a hopeless alcoholic with a broken body, a man who had left a trail behind him of broken marriages, discarded mistresses, and a life really full of public and private scandal. The life of Charles Edward Stuart really is one of a tragic downward spiral into the bondage and the imprisonment of sin. And folks, his life, as you read it and as I have summarized it for you, it essentially encapsulates the life of God's people for over 400 years in the book of Judges. You read through this book and a clear pattern emerges. The people of God, when they have a strong leader like Samson, or a strong leader like Jephthah, who we looked at around the table last Sabbath morning, when they had a strong godly leader, then they were walking with God, and things, it seemed, were going well for the nation. But whenever that strong leader disappeared for a little while, then they fell into bondage and ultimately into sin. And God would raise up pagan nations around the people of God, an ancient enemy, for example, like the Philistines, or even like the Midianites that we are reading of here today, the Canaanites as well. And they would oppress them. They would oppress the people of God. They would starve them. They would take over their homes, take over their farmlands, etc. All with the point of getting the people of God to turn back to the Lord. And so this cycle has already happened 3 times as we come to Judges chapter 6. The people of God, they have succumbed to various enemies, and God has raised up Othniel. Then they have went away from the Lord again. He has then raised up Shamgar, of course, with his ox goad. And then, of course, again, they have succumbed to sin and to bondage. And so God raised up Deborah as well as Barak. And of course, in the previous chapter, chapter 5, you have the song of Deborah and how God worked mightily in her day. And so we come now to the 4th cycle already. The 4th cycle of the people of God turning their backs on God, him raising up an enemy, and then them turning afresh to the Lord. Now, the other individuals, whilst they seem to be fairly unlikely deliverers, there is another sense in which many of them had a military background. Barak, for example, had a military background. Othniel, the great deliverer, had also a military background, and whilst at the beginning Jephthah did not, then he certainly would go on to have one. But this man Gideon, he seems a completely different kettle of fish altogether, because he appears very timid, very shy. We might even use the term backward, and you know what I mean by that in these parts. And yet God raised up this timid, this shy man. He appears to him to deliver the people of God from the Midianites. The name Gideon here is very interesting. It means he who cuts down. He who cuts down. And that's very interesting, because in the next chapter you're going to see God cutting down the army of Israel to just 300. And then, of course, in the rest of chapter 7, you're going to see him cut down in a wonderful way the army of the Midianites, essentially but with just a few hundred men. And so the Lord comes and he appears to this doubting man, this timid man, this shy man, and raises him up in the midst of abject declension, abject apostasy and apathy amongst God's people. And he raises him up, folks, and he uses him mightily. And he uses him in a way in which he doesn't the previous judges. Because he wins a battle without even going to battle. God, of course, discomfits. He confuses the Midianite army, and they essentially turn against themselves, as you read of in chapter 7. And folks, we must never forget that God, this is often the way he gets his work done. He uses quiet people, he uses timid people, he uses shy people, he uses those who feel like they haven't the ability, they perhaps weren't from a particular family, they haven't reached the upper echelons, as it were, in God's work, they haven't a name, so to speak. If you feel like that today, then you're just like Gideon. You feel that well, I haven't the ability of so-and-so, I haven't the strength of so-and-so, I haven't the knowledge of so-and-so. This is exactly where Gideon was, folks. And so God comes, and God deals with him in a wonderful way. And at the end of the chapter, he appears to him in one of those wonderful names, Jehovah Shalom, the Lord our peace. And he just puts to flight and puts to bed all of Gideon's fears and worries and doubts. And he goes, and as I said, he sees a wonderful work done with just 300 men. Just 300. Oh, he had thousands at the beginning, but God cuts that army down to size. And here in this chapter, we see Gideon being cut down to size by God, and preparing him and readying him for that which God has him to do. So let's look at this man and just think of how God dealt with Gideon before he would go and do this mighty work. And I trust that it'll be an encouragement for us all as we think about the work of God here. I want you to see his perplexity. His perplexity. Let's really then get into how Gideon feels at the start and in the middle of this chapter. Look at verse 13. So the Lord appears to him in the form of a Christophany. He's described here as an angel of the Lord. And we read that Gideon said to him, that's the Lord, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? Where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And so here, as I've said, we are in this fourth cycle of the people of God in a state of apostasy. Apostasy in the sense that they have turned their backs on God and other nations around them. The Midianites, they have gathered force and gathered steam. Verse 2 speaks of the hand of Midian prevailing against Israel. And because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains and caves and strongholds. So you know as well as I do, Israel, they were a farming people, largely speaking. They loved to be out in the country. They loved to be out labouring in their fields and building their homes and their cities and their towns, etc. It was a land of hills and valleys. But where do we find Israel now in verse 2 of chapter 6? We find them on the run. We find them hiding. We find them quite literally in dens, in caves, in mountains and strongholds. Of course, many of the towns and cities in Israel, they were surrounded by caves and by mountainous areas. And so they have retreated to the mountains. They've retreated to the caves. They are not out doing what God has called them to do, what they enjoy doing. No. They've had to live like nomads. They've had to abandon their livelihoods, their homes, their cities, and literally live in caves. They've essentially, folks, just rolled over and accepted their fate and their lot. Verses 3 and 4, we then read of the enemy taking away their livelihood. It speaks there about them, verse 4, leaving no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass. They came at a time of seed time. It seems when you read verses 3 and 4, they were at that time, sowing of the seed, getting ready for the harvest, the start of the year. And they have come at such a time, and they have just destroyed the lands. They have destroyed the fields. They haven't left them with so much as a cattle or an ox or an ass. Verse 6, and we're just sort of running through these verses here, folks. Verse 6 says, Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. In the Hebrew, the term impoverished, well, it could be understood in a more simpler way. They were at the end of their rope, quite literally. They were impoverished. They were at the end of their rope. They were at the end of their tether. They were at wit's end. They had, as I've said, to retreat. They saw the enemy. You imagine it, looking out the house. You see the enemy come. You see them destroy your fields, your lands, take your animals, take everything that really you need to survive. And that is why we have this peculiar incident in verse 11 where we find this man, Gideon. Verse 11, we read, there came an angel of the Lord, sat under an oak, which was an Ophrah, that pertained to Joash the Abiezrite, and son Gideon, threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now the farmer's reading that verse, you should know straight away, what's he doing, threshing wheat at a winepress? Verse 11 tells us why. He's hiding from the Midianites. He should be at the winepress, of course, crushing grapes, but he's not. He's literally hiding behind the winepress and he's threshing wheat. Now, of course, when you think of Ruth chapter 3, you have a very, very clear image of what threshing looked like. You would go up onto a hill where many people could see. You think of Boaz, for example, and there he is. He's up on the hill of Bethlehem. He's threshing wheat. He's throwing it up in the air. He's waiting for the wind to take the chaff. So you need to be elevated to really thresh it. In Bible times, that was the way it was done. But here in verse 11, Gideon's threshing wheat behind a winepress. He doesn't want the enemy to even see him thresh out a little bit of wheat. He's not up out on the hills, not out on the open. No, he's hiding it from the Midianites. And verse 11 tells us there came an angel of the Lord. And this angel of the Lord, he takes the form of some form of being. And we read in verse 11, he just sits under an oak tree. He's just sitting there under a large oak tree, it seems. And he's just in the vicinity of Gideon as he's threshing behind this winepress. Now you'll notice verse 12. This angel of the Lord, really a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ this is. We read, the Lord simply says to Gideon, the angel who appeared to him said unto him, the Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. Gideon, the Lord's with you. Gideon, you're a mighty man of valor. You're a mighty man of strength. And yet, verse 13, Gideon, he immediately questions this business of the Lord being with him. If the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? If the Lord is with me and the Lord is with us, why is all of this happening in the nation and in the land? If the Lord truly is favouring us, then why is it that we have succumbed to this ancient enemy? So you see here he's questioning the power of God. Hey Lord, if you're truly with us here, then why have we not the strength to drive out the enemy? Why has the enemy come and taken us over? He's doubting the power of God. He's also doubting the plan of God. Verse 13. Why then is all this befallen us? Lord, if you're favouring us, if this is your will, if this is your plan, why is this happening to us? Why is the land in the state in which it is? Why is this happening? And folks, sometimes when we think about the work of God, sometimes we can feel like this, can't we? I mean, if God is truly with his church, if the Lord promises to truly build his church, if the Lord promises, as we have been singing, that he will never, never leave us nor forsake us, then we might put it in a very simple way. Why is it that all of these things befall us? And we look around and we see in general, and we feel ourselves perhaps to be just at the juncture in which Gideon felt himself to be in terms of the nation and in terms of the people of God and the work of God. We look around and in general, we see a general trend of apostasy and declension and turning away from the Lord. In general, we see a spirit of apathy. We feel it within our own souls. We feel ourselves, I trust, to be impoverished, just like it speaks of here in this chapter. Now, what's the result of such? Well, whenever they had turned their backs on God, what did they lose? Think of what they lost, folks. They lost that sense of freedom. They're in bondage to the enemy. They lost that sense of fruitfulness, very obviously. I mean, they have no ground anymore to plough up and to dig up. They're in caves now, they're in retreat. And to put it very, very simply and generally, folks, they lost their sense of fight. They lost that kind of desire, that kind of will to war a good warfare. It seems as though they've just given up. And perhaps you feel like that today. You look around and you feel, well, I've just lost my sense of fight. And I'm not talking here, of course, in the carnal fighting in that sense, because the weapons of our warfare, they are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. But you know what I mean, that sense of fight, that sense of struggle. And so you look around and you feel perhaps like Gideon. Lord, if you're with us, where's all the miracles, Lord? Where's all the conversions? Where is all of the salvation blessing? And then the Lord begins to single you out, and you feel, well, what's the point? What's the point in going on with God? And what's the point in fighting for God and serving the Lord? Questioning God, perhaps, questioning his power, questioning his plan. Perhaps you feel like the little girl who was listening to her mummy tell the great stories, the Bible stories about the wonderful saints in the past, of how Moses saw miracles and wonderful things done, the crossing of the Red Sea, as she spoke of Samson and how strong he was. And finally she turned to her mummy and said, Mummy, you know, God was way more exciting back then. Maybe you feel like that. Oh, a few years ago, God was way more exciting back then. That's where Gideon is. He mentions it, he references it, does he not, in verse 13? Where is all the miracles that our fathers have told us of? Those who have went before us. Those like Othniel, the great deliverer. And if you even go further back, like Joshua and like Caleb. That's only a few generations really ago when you think about Gideon and his day. Gideon, he knew of Joshua. He knew of Caleb, a man who wholly followed the Lord. And so he feels, if he's honest, he feels as though God was just a lot more stronger, from his perspective, a lot more powerful. God was way more exciting back then. That's where Gideon is. That's his perplexity. But I want you to see then, secondly, his promise. His promise. This angel of the Lord comes and gives to him a promise, verse 14. The Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent thee? And he said unto him, so this is Gideon now, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. No, we must remember what he has already said in verse 12 and 13. The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. God has already, the angel of the Lord has already spoken to Gideon and said that the Lord's with you. You're a mighty man of valor. Gideon, you're a mighty man of strength. You're going to be a strong individual, Gideon. And then he doubts God, and where be all these miracles, etc., verse 13. And then God in verse 14 comes and moves again and gives him this promise. Verse 14, Thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? Gideon, I'm going to raise you up, and I am sending you, Gideon. And you're going to save God's people from the hand of the Midianites. Gideon is questioning here. After all, the Midianites, it seems they have the upper hand. And so then he really reveals his heart here in verse 15 to the Lord. Lord, are you sure you've got the right address here? Wherewith shall I save Israel? My family is poor in Manasseh. So you see here straight away, he's speaking of where he's from. He says, I'm from Manasseh here. Manasseh was not one of the large tribes of Israel. It did not have the size of Judah, and it did not have the clout of Levi, so to speak. It was just a small tribe. It's a little bit like Benjamin, just a small piece of ground, Manasseh. So he's saying to the Lord, Lord, I'm from Manasseh. You don't usually raise up people from Manasseh, Lord. You usually go straight to Judah. You usually raise up a Levitical priest, Lord, to be a prophet, to be a judge. But I'm from Manasseh. But no, he goes on to say in verse 15, my family is poor in Manasseh. So not only is he from Manasseh, and this is unusual, but my family is a poor family in Manasseh. We're not some of those renowned families in like some of these tribes. We're not like the Kohathites, for example, or some of those other families of renown. We're just a little poor family, just in a little corner of Manasseh, Lord. He goes on a step further in verse 15 to say this, and I am the least in my father's house. I'm from Manasseh, Lord. My family's not a big family in terms of a family of renowned. And more than that, Lord, I'm the least in my family's house. Perhaps it's a reference to the fact that he's the only believer. The reason I say this is because the name Gideon, you also read in chapter 6 here at the end of the chapter that he had another name, and into chapter 7, Jerub-Baal. And the reference really, when you look at his father as well, his father was a gross idolater. His father was a Baal worshipper. And that's why he is called, his other name is Jerub-Baal, or Baal. His other name shows that his father wants him to belong to Baal, Gideon. And perhaps he's alluding to that. Maybe he's alluding to the fact that maybe he's just the youngest in the family. We can't be too sure, but whatever it is, he feels himself to be the weakest amongst this weak family, amongst this small tribe in Israel. And so when we go back to it again, what does the Lord say to him in verse 14? Go in this thy might, Gideon. I have sent you. Verse 12, I am with you, you mighty man of valor, you mighty man of strength. And so God is calling him. God is promising him strength. God is promising him he would be with him. God is actually calling him a mighty man of valor, of integrity, of strength. But all the while Gideon's doubting it. Lord, you've got the wrong address here. You've got the wrong person. You've got the wrong family. Lord, you've even got the wrong part of the country. And this is often your reply, child of God, is it not? When the Lord deals with you about being a deliverer, about being doing a work for him, we look around and we think to ourselves, well, you know, what can I do really? Sure, I'm just a nobody. And I'm not from any great family, so-called, in the church or in God's work, though those things, when you really think about it, don't exist in a sense, because we're all the same before God. But you know what I mean? From our psyche, this is how things appear. Lord, I have nothing to offer you. Let's put it very, very simply, as Gideon puts it. Lord, I'm just a farm boy from a wee country family. That's really what he's saying to God. He's hiding. He's literally hiding behind a winepress. He's like Jonah, who's running from the presence of the Lord. Lord, I'm not respected. Lord, I'm not equipped. Lord, I haven't the strength. You feel yourself to be like that, child of God. You're showing yourself to be a prime candidate to do something for the Lord, to be engaged in the work of God, to be a deliverer. This is how God often works. You think of one of the first judges, as I've said, Shamgar, and how he defeated 600 of the enemy with just an ox goad. Just a piece of farming machinery, folks. And he saw a mighty work done. You think of Samson. Just the job of bone of an ass. 1,000 Philistines slain. We looked around the table last Sunday morning at Jephthah. And of course Jephthah, yes, he was a military man in a sense, but Jephthah was an outcast. Jephthah was the son of Gilead, but he was the illegitimate son of Gilead. He was the son of an harlot. And so much so that his other brothers actually cast him out of the family home. He was an outcast. God raised him up to do something wonderful for him. You think in the New Testament of people like Matthew, this Jewish tax collector, this turncoat, this man who was collecting money for the enemy, for the other side, for the Romans. And yet the Lord saved him, made him a mighty instrument of God, and so much so, entrusted him with the writing of Holy Scripture. Think about it. Saved him. Oh, Israel was crying out for a deliverer, and the answer at this time was not a tall, dark, strong man like Samson. No, the answer for God's people at this time was Gideon. Child of God, the Lord's on the lookout for his Gideons today. And he's promising you, verse 14, he's promising you his strength. You feel like you haven't the strength to do it, that's fine. God gives you the strength. You feel like you haven't the ability to do it, well, God comes to you. And though you may not feel yourself to be a mighty man or daughter or woman of valor, he calls you such. Isaiah 40 verse 29 is very apt at this point. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. Those who have no might, those who have no strength, he increases strength. He gives you strength. He increases the levels of strength that you possess. Charles Haddon Spurgeon was just 19 years of age whenever he received a call to pastor Park Street Church in London. He felt as though it was a mistake. He literally felt as though they had got the other person. He actually felt that they had called another person, this is the truth, called Charles Spurgeon, whenever he received the letter, in the telegram as it would have been then. And yet very early on, that young man, he understood that the Lord gives strength, he equips us, he enables us, and he of course became the Prince of Preachers that everybody knew and loved. His perplexity, his promise. I want you to see lastly here then, as God dealt with Gideon, his proof. His proof, verse 17. So, the Lord has given him so much already, hasn't he? The Lord has said, you're a strong individual, I am sending you, I am equipping you, I am enabling you. But Gideon still doubts, verse 17. If now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. And of course, as he receives this sign that we're going to look at, he then asks for another sign. He asks for the sign of the fleece towards the end of the chapter. He was someone who was of very doubtful disposition. But notice verse 21. We read, the angel of the Lord put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand, and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes that rose up from of fire out of the rock, consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Then the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. And so he comes to this angel of the Lord, having already received this help and this encouragement. Show me a sign, angel. And so the angel of the Lord tells him to do something, verses 18 through 21. He tells him to make an offering of the Lord. Now, it's something that essentially resembles the meat or the grain offering, mixed with a burnt offering as well in Bible times. And so what this angel of the Lord, what the Lord tells Gideon to do, very simply, is to get a goat, get some kind of unleavened cakes, not like a cake that we would think of today, but more something like a kind of a lot of fruit and vegetables kind of together. And then also he speaks here of a pot of broth in these verses 18 and following. And bring it as a present to the Lord, or as the word really means in the Hebrew, an offering. Now again, this demands great faith from Gideon, because this is a time of declension. This is a time whenever the enemy, there's not much by way of grain or unleavened cakes, or the material for the unleavened cakes, or animals. They have taken them all. And so he goes. This would have been very costly, very hard for Gideon to do. He gets to himself a little goat where he finds one. He gets some vegetables and he makes this pot of broth, this pot of vegetable broth. Stew, you might even call it. And then the angel of the Lord tells him to do something. He tells him in verse 20, lay them upon this rock, pour out the broth, and he did so. So he tells him to lay the goat on this rock and lay the unleavened cakes on a rock and pour the broth out on the goat and these cakes. So it's essentially like pouring broth or soup on an animal. Okay, that's what it resembles. Now what happens? Verse 21. The angel of the Lord, Christ himself, takes his staff. Not that there's anything miraculous in the staff. There's nothing kind of magical or anything in this staff. But he takes his staff and he touches this concoction that he has asked Gideon to put together. And as Gideon pours out this broth, something magical or something miraculous happens. Fire comes up from the midst of the rock and completely consumes the goat and these cakes as well. Completely consumes the sacrifice. What is he showing Gideon here? He's showing Gideon this, that Gideon, you are accepted now. You don't have to fear, you don't have to worry. Gideon, you're accepted on the grounds of a sacrifice. That's what this goat represented. And yet, there is the mixture of the work of man in a sense, because that's really what the offering represents. It's really representative of the fact that man must come and man must have faith in the sacrifice that is before him. You remember Cain and Abel. Well, Cain's offering, it was viewed as the fruit of his hands, the work of his hands. And of course, Abel, the animal. And then we find in verse 24 that the Lord reveals himself in this wonderful way. Gideon then, after this, he builds an altar. He calls it Jehovah Shalom. Unto this day in Ophrah, in the Abi Ezrites, Jehovah Shalom, the Lord our peace. Because as Gideon did this, and as the angel of the Lord caused this fire to completely take this sacrifice, Gideon fears for his life. Verse 22, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. He feels as though he's going to die, and he should die. That's why verse 23, God says to him, peace be to thee, fear not, thou shalt not die. He recognizes, perhaps it's an allusion to the fact of Moses' day, that the fire came and consumed him, or consumed the bush. Maybe he looks at this fire and he thinks that God said, I am to Moses. This is I am. This is the great I am before me. He feels that he should die. And the Lord said, you'll not die. I am Jehovah Shalom. You're at peace with me, Gideon. And Gideon, after his fleece, as he wants to know the will of God now, as someone at peace with God, he then goes in chapter 7 and does that wonderful work for the Lord. Child of God, what is it this morning that enables you to step forward and move forward in your walk with God and in the work of God? It's a fresh vision of Jehovah Shalom, the Lord your peace. And you have things that perplex you, that worry you, that concern the mind, that concern the soul, perhaps even that grieve the soul today. And at times our peace can be disturbed. Perhaps the Lord is laying his hand upon you to do something. You feel, well, look, I'm not at peace here. I'm not so sure about this. Look at the one who was the sacrifice for you. The fact, of course, that God consumed him. In that sense, our God is a consuming fire, Hebrews tells us. And of course, therefore, the judgment of God fell in Jesus Christ. We look at the cross, folks. And by faith, we move forward as we have Jehovah Shalom, the Lord our peace, with us. That ought to greatly encourage you, child of God, today. That if as God wants to do something with you, yes, there's the promise of his presence, which is wonderful, but you're at peace with him today through the blood of his cross. and being at peace with him, then in your life, that breeds peace for you. And Gideon here, he knows great peace, he knows great strength, he knows great help just by this knowledge that Jehovah Shalom is my God. That this God is my God. And therefore I'm going to move forward, even though I have severe doubts, and even though I doubt myself, and even though I doubt God's choice of me, and God's choice of me from my family and from my area. I'm going to move forward, because I have seen Jehovah Shalom, and the Lord is my peace, and I'm at peace with him. I trust that as God dealt with Gideon,